The first gunshot of the day echoed through Willow Creek just as Zara Foster pushed open the doors of the auction house. Her cheeks stained with tears and her heart heavier than the iron safe in her father's study. Wyoming Territory, 1876, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the turn of a card, and where a woman without protection might as well wear a target on her back. Zara's hands trembled as she clutched the deed to her family's ranch, the ink barely dry where her dying father had signed it over to her 3 days prior. The vultures had wasted no time. Debts she never knew existed, taxes unpaid, and now the bank was calling due what she couldn't hope to pay. Final call for Lot 27, prime cattle land 10 miles south of Willow Creek. The auctioneer's voice rang through the crowded room, cutting through her grief like a knife. Men in suits and ranchers in dusty chaps all turned to stare as she stumbled toward the front, her once fine blue dress now wrinkled from 3 nights of fitful sleep. "Wait," she called, her voice cracking. "That's Foster land." "My father's ranch was your father's ranch, miss," corrected a sleek-haired man in an expensive suit. "Lawrence Briggs, the banker who'd been circling her father like a vulture for years. Now it's going to whoever can pay what's owed, unless you've brought $400 with you." $400 might as well have been 4,000. Zara felt the room spin as fresh tears welled in her eyes. "Going once," the auctioneer called. In the corner of the room, Vaughn Sutton pushed away from the wall where he'd been observing the proceedings with interest. At 30, he'd built a reputation as one of the most successful cattle ranchers in the territory, despite starting with nothing but a horse and determination 6 years ago. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he studied Zara's desperate expression. "Going twice." Zara sank to her knees, dignity forgotten. "Please," she whispered, though no one seemed to hear. $500. The deep voice cut through the commotion, causing heads to turn. Vaughn Sutton stood with his hat in his hand, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his brow. "500 from Sutton," the auctioneer announced, clearly surprised. "600, countered Briggs immediately, his thin lips pressing together in irritation. "7, Vaughn replied without hesitation. The room fell silent as the 2 men locked eyes. Briggs was wealthy, but everyone knew Sutton had built his empire through sheer determination and grit. The banker hesitated, calculating. "800, he finally said, a triumphant gleam in his eye. Vaughn didn't blink. $1,000. A collective gasp swept through the room. Briggs' face reddened as he glared at Sutton, but after a tense moment, he gave a curt shake of his head. "Going once, going twice. Sold to Vaughn Sutton for $1,000. Zara remained on her knees, stunned, as the crowd began to disperse. The next lot was already being called, but she couldn't move. She had lost everything: her father, her home, her future in the span of 3 days. Then a shadow fell over her, and she looked up to see Vaughn Sutton standing before her, his hand extended. "Miss Foster," he said quietly, "I believe we have some business to discuss." With trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm and calloused from years of hard work, yet he held her hand gently as though it were made of the finest gold. He helped her to her feet and guided her through the crowd toward the exit. "Why?" she managed to ask as they stepped into the sunlight. "Why would you pay so much?" Vaughn looked down at her, his expression softening slightly. "Because some things are worth more than their price." His eyes, the color of a summer storm, studied her face. "Your father was a good man, Miss Foster. He helped me when I first came to this territory with nothing but my name." "I didn't know," she whispered. "There's a lot about your father you probably don't know," Vaughn said as he led her down the boardwalk, "including why Briggs was so eager to take that land." Zara stopped abruptly. "What do you mean?" Vaughn glanced around, then lowered his voice. "There's a reason your father never sold, despite Briggs' offers. There's water rights involved that Briggs has been trying to control for years. That land's worth far more than $1,000. Hope flickered briefly in Zara's chest before reality extinguished it. "It doesn't matter now." "It's yours." "Actually," Vaughn said, I was hoping we might come to an arrangement. They had reached his horse, a magnificent black stallion that pawed impatiently at the dirt. Vaughn didn't immediately elaborate, instead helping her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. "Where are we going?" she asked, suddenly aware of how this might appear to the townspeople watching. "To your ranch," he replied. "Or would you prefer to stay in town with the gossips and vultures?" Put that way, she had little choice. She sat stiffly as they rode out of Willow Creek, the weight of his chest against her back unfamiliar yet oddly comforting. They rode in silence for most of the journey, the Wyoming landscape stretching endlessly around them, until the familiar silhouette of her family home appeared on the horizon. The Foster ranch house wasn't grand, but it had been built with care, a sturdy two-story structure with a wide porch where her father used to sit and smoke his pipe in the evenings. The sight of it brought fresh tears to Zara's eyes. "I'll need to collect my things," she said as Vaughn helped her dismount. "I don't have much, but you misunderstand me, Miss Foster," Vaughn interrupted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "I'm not here to take your home." Zara stared at him in confusion as he reached into his coat and pulled out the deed he'd just purchased. "This land is rightfully yours. I merely kept it from falling into Briggs' hands." "But you paid $1,000, she protested. "I can't repay that kind of money." "I'm not asking for repayment," he said, then hesitated. "At least, not in the way you're thinking." He gestured toward the house, and they sat together on the porch steps as Vaughn explained his proposal. The ranch needed work and management. Zara had the knowledge of the land but lacked the manpower and resources. Vaughn had both, along with the neighboring property to the east. "A partnership," he concluded. "You keep your home and half the profits. I supply the men and cattle. Together we build something worth having." Zara studied his face for deception but found only straightforward honesty. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" "You're not a stranger, Miss Foster. Your father spoke of you often during our business dealings." A faint smile crossed his face. He was quite proud of his educated daughter. "My education hasn't prepared me for any of this," she admitted, gesturing to the ranch around them. "Perhaps not," Vaughn agreed, "but you've got Foster blood, and if you're anything like your father, you don't give up easily." He extended his hand again. "Do we have a deal, Miss Foster?" She hesitated only briefly before shaking his hand. "Zara," she said, "if we're to be partners, you should call me Zara." "Vaughn," he returned with a nod. That night, Zara lay awake in her childhood bedroom, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. She knew nothing about Vaughn Sutton beyond his reputation as a successful rancher. He could easily take advantage of her situation. Yet something about his steady gaze and forthright manner made her inclined to trust him. The following days proved her instincts correct. Vaughn arrived early each morning with supplies and men, working alongside them to repair fences and assess the property. He consulted Zara on every decision, listening to her opinions with genuine interest and respect. "Your father kept meticulous records," Vaughn remarked one evening as they sat at the kitchen table reviewing ledgers. "These breeding notes could be valuable." Zara nodded, fighting back the grief that still ambushed her at unexpected moments. He believed in doing things properly. "He used to say that shortcuts lead to long delays." "Wise man," Vaughn murmured, his eyes lingering on her face. "You have his determination." Zara felt her cheeks warm under his gaze and quickly returned to the papers before her. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd become increasingly aware of Vaughn as more than just her business partner. He moved with a quiet confidence that drew the eye, and when he smiled, a rare occurrence, it transformed his serious expression into something that made her heart beat faster. "There's a cattle auction in Cheyenne next week," Vaughn said, breaking into her thoughts. "We should attend together, start building our herd." "Cheyenne," Zara repeated, alarmed. "That's a 2-day journey." "At least," Vaughn agreed. "We'd need to stay overnight." Zara bit her lip, considering the implications. A woman traveling alone with a man who wasn't her husband or relation would cause talk, even in the relatively liberal atmosphere of the Wyoming Territory. "I can't," she finally said. "It wouldn't be proper." Vaughn nodded, unsurprised. I thought you might say that. That's why I took the liberty of arranging for Mrs. Calloway to accompany us. She's agreed to act as your chaperone. Mrs. Calloway was the widow who kept house for Vaughn, a formidable woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense manner that brooked no argument. You've thought of everything, Zara said, surprised and a little touched by his consideration. Not everything, Vaughn replied with a slight smile, but I'm learning to anticipate your concerns. The trip to Cheyenne proved transformative in ways Zara couldn't have anticipated. The bustling territorial capital was a far cry from the quiet life she'd known in Willow Creek. Hotels and restaurants lined the streets, alongside saloons and shops selling everything from hats to harmonicas, under Mrs. Calloway's watchful eye, Zara and Vaughn attended the cattle auction, where his reputation preceded them. Other ranchers greeted him with respect, and Zara noticed more than a few curious glances directed her way. Sutton's never brought a woman to auction before, she overheard one man mutter to another. Must be serious. The comment should have embarrassed her, but instead, Zara felt a strange flutter of pleasure. She found herself watching Vaughn more closely as he negotiated prices and selected stock, admiring his shrewd business sense and the respect he commanded. That evening, they dined at the hotel restaurant, Mrs. Calloway a silent sentinel at a nearby table. Over steaks and potatoes far finer than anything Zara had cooked at the ranch, Vaughn surprised her by asking about her life before Wyoming. St. Louis seems a world away now, Zara admitted, describing the finishing school her father had insisted she attend. I was supposed to become a proper lady and make an advantageous marriage, but I never fit in with the other girls. I was always more interested in books than balls. Your father indulged your education, Vaughn observed. After my mother died, he couldn't deny me anything, Zara said with a sad smile. He used to say I was too smart for my own good, but he never tried to change me. I'm glad, Vaughn said quietly. The world has enough proper ladies, it needs more women who think for themselves. His words warmed her more than the glass of wine she'd barely touched. And what about you? She asked. You've never mentioned your family. A shadow passed over Vaughn's face. There's not much to tell. My father was a drunk who gambled away our farm in Missouri. My mother died of fever when I was 14. I left home the next day and never looked back. I'm sorry, Zara said softly. Vaughn shrugged. It taught me self-reliance and the value of keeping one's word. He met her gaze directly. I want you to know, Zara, that I will always honor our agreement. Your ranch will remain yours. Our ranch, she corrected him gently. That was the deal, wasn't it? A partnership. Something flickered in his eyes. Yes, a partnership. The tension between them shifted subtly, and Zara found herself wondering if Vaughn felt the same inexplicable pull that she did. But Mrs. Calloway chose that moment to announce that it was getting late, and the moment passed. The following morning, they purchased 30 head of prime cattle to begin rebuilding the Foster herd. The journey back to Willow Creek seemed shorter somehow, with Zara and Vaughn riding side by side, discussing their plans for the ranch while Mrs. Calloway dozed in the rented wagon that transported their belongings. We should celebrate our first business venture, Vaughn suggested as they approached the ranch on the second day. A proper dinner. I'll have Mrs. Calloway prepare something special. I'd like that, Zara replied, surprised to find herself looking forward to an evening in his company. The celebration dinner exceeded Zara's expectations. Mrs. Calloway had outdone herself with roast beef, fresh bread, and even a berry pie for dessert. Vaughn arrived wearing a clean shirt and jacket, his dark hair still damp from washing. He'd even brought a bottle of French wine, a luxury rarely seen in Willow Creek. To new beginnings, he toasted, raising his glass. And successful partnerships, Zara added. They talked late into the evening, the conversation flowing easily from ranch business to books they'd read to childhood memories. Zara found herself laughing more than she had since her father's death, and when Vaughn finally rose to leave, she felt an unexpected reluctance to see him go. "Thank you," she said at the door. "Not just for dinner, but for everything you've done." Vaughn looked down at her, his expression softening in the lamplight. "You don't need to thank me, Zara. I'm getting as much from this arrangement as you are." "Are you?" she asked quietly. For a moment, she thought he might say more, might acknowledge the unspoken current that seemed to flow between them whenever they were alone. Instead, he merely nodded and reached for his hat. "Good night," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Good night, Vaughn." As spring gave way to summer, the partnership flourished. The Foster ranch came alive again, with cattle grazing the pastures and hands calling to one another as they worked. Vaughn was a constant presence, teaching Zara about cattle breeding and range management, listening to her ideas about crop rotation for the hay fields. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during the day and often sharing meals in the evening. Mrs. Calloway, who now split her time between Vaughn's ranch and the Foster place, watched their growing friendship with knowing eyes but kept her observations to herself. It was during a violent summer storm that everything changed between them. Zara had ridden out to check on a pregnant heifer, ignoring the darkening sky. When the rain began, she sought shelter in an old line shack, only to find herself trapped as lightning struck a nearby tree, bringing it down across the only path back to the ranch. The storm raged for hours, and as darkness fell, Zara resigned herself to spending an uncomfortable night in the primitive shelter. Then, through the howl of the wind, she heard a voice calling her name. Vaughn appeared in the doorway, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "Thank God," he said when he saw her. "When you didn't come back. How did you find me?" she asked, stunned by his appearance. "I know where all the line shacks are," he replied, stripping off his dripping coat. "And I know you well enough by now to guess you'd seek shelter rather than try to ride through it." His matter-of-fact tone couldn't quite mask the relief in his eyes, and Zara realized with a jolt that he had been worried, genuinely worried about her. "You shouldn't have come out in this," she scolded, handing him the only blanket the shack contained. "It's dangerous." "So is leaving you alone out here," he countered, running a hand through his wet hair. "There are wolves in these parts, not to mention less savory characters passing through." "I can handle myself," Zara insisted, though she was touched by his concern. Vaughn gave her a wry smile. "I don't doubt it, but I would have worried all night." The admission hung between them in the small space, more intimate than any words they'd exchanged before. Zara busied herself building up the meager fire in the shack's tiny stove, acutely aware of Vaughn changing into a dry shirt he'd somehow managed to keep protected in his saddlebag. "I brought provisions," he said, producing a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Nothing fancy, but better than nothing." They shared jerky, hard bread, and a flask of whiskey as the storm continued to rage outside. The shack's lone chair and narrow cot meant they sat close together, shoulders touching as they talked in low voices about everything and nothing. "My father would be scandalized," Zara said with a small laugh. "Me alone in a shack with a man not my husband." "Your father was a practical man," Vaughn replied. "He'd understand the circumstances." "Would he?" Zara turned to look at him, suddenly serious. "Or would he wonder why his business partner looks at his daughter the way you sometimes look at me?" The words escaped before she could reconsider them, and Zara immediately wished she could take them back. Vaughn went very still beside her. "And how is that?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Zara's courage faltered. "Never mind, I spoke out of turn." "No," Vaughn said, turning to face her fully. "You didn't." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "I've tried to keep my feelings separate from our business arrangement. I didn't want you to think I had ulterior motives that day at the auction." "Did you?" she asked, barely breathing. "No," he said firmly, "but I can't deny that I've come to care for you as more than a business partner." The confession hung in the air between them, and Zara found herself leaning toward him almost instinctively. When his lips met hers, tentative at first and then with growing confidence, she felt as though something long dormant inside her had finally awakened. The storm eventually passed, but something fundamental had changed between them. Over the following weeks, they continued to work together as partners, but there were new moments of connection, hands touching as they passed tools, private smiles exchanged across crowded corrals, conversations that lasted long into the evening. Yet Vaughn never presumed, never pushed for more than Zara was ready to give. He courted her properly, bringing wildflowers he'd picked himself and taking her for Sunday drives in his buggy. The town noticed. Of course, Willow Creek was too small for secrets, but the general consensus was approval. Vaughn Sutton had proven himself a man of integrity, and Zara Foster deserved happiness after her loss. It was during the autumn cattle drive that disaster struck. Zara had insisted on participating, wanting to learn every aspect of the ranch business. She held her own among the cowboys, earning their grudging respect with her determination and quick learning. 3 days into the drive, as they moved the herd across a shallow river, a rattlesnake spooked Zara's horse. The animal reared, throwing her into the rushing water. Vaughn, riding nearby, dismounted in an instant and plunged in after her, but the current had already swept her downstream. He found her half-drowned on a sandbar, pale and still. For one terrible moment he thought he'd lost her, until she coughed and water spilled from her lips. "Don't you dare die on me," he ordered, gathering her into his arms. "Do you hear me, Zara Foster? Don't you dare." She opened her eyes, disoriented. "Vaughn, I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm right here." Later, wrapped in blankets by the campfire, Zara watched Vaughn as he spoke with the trail boss. His face was drawn with lingering fear, and she realized with sudden clarity how much she had come to mean to him and he to her. When he returned to her side, she took his hand. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. "A dangerous pastime," he teased, though his eyes remained serious. "I think our partnership has proven successful," she continued. "Perhaps we should consider making it permanent." Vaughn went very still. "What exactly are you suggesting, Zara?" She smiled up at him, suddenly sure. "I believe the traditional term is marriage, Mr. Sutton." For a moment he simply stared at her, then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming it. "You're proposing to me?" "Someone had to," she replied. "And I've never been one for traditional roles." Vaughn laughed, a full, rich sound that turned heads around the campfire. Then he sobered, taking both her hands in his. "Are you certain? Marriage to a rancher isn't easy even for someone raised to it." "I'm certain about you," she said simply. "The rest we'll figure out together." They were married in Willow Creek's small church 2 weeks later, with half the town in attendance. Zara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Mrs. Calloway, and Vaughn looked uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit ordered from Cheyenne. "Never thought I'd see the day," remarked one old-timer as they emerged from the church. "Sutton always said he'd never marry. Some vows are made to be broken," his companion replied with a knowing smile, "especially when the right woman comes along." The newlyweds combined their properties, creating one of the largest spreads in the county. They built a new house halfway between the original ranches, a symbol of their fresh start together. Vaughn insisted on carrying Zara across the threshold the day it was completed, both of them laughing as he nearly tripped on the new carpet. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sutton," he said, setting her down in the front hall. "Our home," she corrected, looking around at the rooms they had planned together. "Built on a partnership. That began with an auction," Vaughn reminded her, pulling her close. "When a beautiful woman walked in with tears in her eyes and I knew my life was about to change forever." "You never told me that," Zara said, surprised. "You knew even then." Vaughn brushed her cheek with his thumb. "I knew there was something special about you. The rest I discovered day by day." As winter settled over Wyoming, bringing long evenings by the fire and mornings of breathtaking frost, Zara and Vaughn built their life together. They argued occasionally, both were strong-willed and opinionated, but always found their way back to each other. Their partnership stronger for the testing. When spring arrived, Bringing new calves and fresh possibilities, Zara had news of her own to share. She told Vaughn one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. "I think we'll need to add a nursery to the house," she said casually, watching his profile. Vaughn turned to her slowly, comprehension dawning in his eyes. "Zara, are you saying?" She nodded, unable to contain her smile. "By winter, there will be 3 of us." The joy that transformed his face was all the response she needed. He gathered her carefully into his arms as though she had suddenly become infinitely precious. "I never dared hope for this much happiness," he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "Nor I," Zara agreed, resting her head against his chest. "Especially not that day I walked into the auction house thinking I'd lost everything." Vaughn kissed the top of her head. "Instead, you found a partner." "I found love," she corrected him softly, "something far more valuable than any ranch." As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, hands entwined, planning their future together, a future that had begun with tears, but promised to hold far more joy than sorrow. The Wyoming wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of sage and promise, as a cowboy, and the woman he treasured like gold watched night fall over the land they both loved, secure in the knowledge that they faced whatever came next together.